In this lesson for today, we're looking at the last lesson for church leadership for the International Academy of Biblical Studies. And it's very important to realize that there comes a point where a local congregation should become independent financially, and preachers should become independent financially from sources outside the local congregation. We know that some congregations are relatively young and they may not be able to fully, for example, fully support the preacher financially. But there comes a point where they should be able to financially take care of the local preacher. And one of the ways that we work toward that end is to work on developing a budget for the local church. I don't know if those who are listening today, if you have a budget for the congregation where you are, but one thing that's for certain is that the local congregation should do all it can financially to take care of its preacher, its own benevolence, its own evangelistic efforts, and whatever other expenses that the church may have. I want to look first at 2 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning with verse 6. Paul has been talking to the brethren at Corinth about the contribution for the poor saints in Jerusalem who were suffering at that time from a famine. But there are principles here, not only for helping those outside the local congregation, but helping the local congregation itself to do its own work. He's speaking to individuals in 2 Corinthians 9 and verse 6. Now this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. That old law of sowing and reaping is still true. And so if you sow sparingly, then you won't reap very much. But if you sow bountifully, you reap much. It's kind of like a farmer. If he wants to have a small crop, he puts out a few seeds. If he wants to have a large crop, he puts out a lot of seeds or a lot of plants. Now, Paul is speaking to individuals here in verse 7 again. Each one must do as he has prospered or purposed in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. An individual must look at his or her income, their financial income, and purpose in their heart what they're going to give for the work of the Lord. Giving must be planned. It should not be, well, I'll see what's in my wallet or my purse this week. If I only have a little bit, that's what I'll give. And then next week, well, let's see what I have today. That is not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches us to purpose or plan in our hearts in advance what we're going to give to the work of the Lord. And you do it in your heart, and you want to give. Now, we are commanded to give. This verse is not teaching that we're not commanded to give. But it says if we do give, we should not give grudgingly. In other words, don't give if you really don't want to do it from your heart or feel compelled to do it. Now, that's kind of a hard thing. The Lord expects us to give, but the way I feel about it is what the Lord is looking at. If I'm doing this because, well, I don't really want to, but I will anyway. That's contrary to what the Bible says. God loves a cheerful giver. He wants us to be happy. Now, what is God able to do if we give as we should? Look at verse 8. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that always having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed or every good work. We know there are many different works of the Lord's church. There is the support of the local evangelist. There is benevolent work to help the needy in the church. There is a need for taking care, if you have a building, taking care of the building itself, or materials for teaching the children and adults to having materials, or maybe buying Bibles, communion supplies, and things like that. And yet, if we give without grudgingly, and we give as we purpose in our heart, and we give generously, we can do a lot of great things from the local church. As it is written, verse 9, he scattered abroad and gave to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. And so there's a time to help the poor, and that's the context of Paul's statement of the church at Corinth helping the poor saints in Jerusalem. Well, sometimes you may not have that situation everywhere, but maybe locally. Now, look at verse 10. Now, he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You'll be enriched in everything for all liberality, which through us is producing thanksgiving to God. So one of the things we learn from 2 Corinthians 9, 6 through 15 is the need to give generously, give lovingly or cheerfully because you want to do it. And if we give in a generous way, the church can do a lot of great things. Well, so the men of the church, or if there are elders in the church, there comes a time where there's a need to make a budget. I worked for a long time as an individual without having a budget. I'd get a paycheck and I'd pay my bills, and then I never really sat down and itemized the needs of my existence. But I started doing that after I got married and making a budget, and it helped me tremendously. I'm convinced the church should have a budget. Looking at the screen, it's important to recognize that someone has estimated that one in every 5 words, one word in every 5 that Jesus spoke during his ministry had to do with the proper or improper use of material possessions or money. And these are realities that we must study, and we must give as we've been prospered, and the leaders of the church, be they elders or faithful local men, take the monies that are given and use them in a way that pleases God. If a congregation tries to operate without serious thought as to financial planning, they will fail. They will not be successful. And so I want to speak for a few minutes about first of all, individuals. We mentioned that, and we notice if you look at 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, again, Paul speaking of helping the poor saints in Jerusalem, that each person is to give. There's a time to teach children to give when they're old enough to understand why they're giving. But let's say that, if you have a job, you as a family, like a husband and wife, may put your money together, but you're both giving. But as a child in that family, maybe you have your own job, or maybe you're a single person, you give from your income and you put something aside so that when the first day of the week comes, you are ready and able to give. Now, let's talk about the work of the local church and some suggestions here on how we have a budget. Number one, you have to plan. You have to plan your budget. And this material, of course, is all printed for those who are taking the course. It's on the screen if you want to read this along. Now, let's say a congregation has elders. The elders may not handle the money. As a matter of fact, if you look at the example in Acts chapter 6, the apostles turned over the work of taking care of the poor widows that were being neglected to some special servants. I believe there's a pattern there for elders and deacons, that the deacons should do the work and handle a lot of the physical work and helping people. They should be given a budget. The elders ought to know where the money's going. I don't believe an elder ought to be managing the money. They should know what's going on with it. The elder's job is to shepherd sheep, not to keep bank accounts. And so you turn that over to someone else. You may not have an eldership, so you can have a committee of faithful men who have some knowledge of money. They're knowledgeable of the church, and they are willing and able to work financially and sit down and make a budget. And if if you have elders should oversee it. If you don't have elders, then a faithful group of men should take that responsibility. And you should talk about it. Talk about the needs of the church. What are the needs of this local congregation? What are the needs that we want to try to help with outside the congregation? Or are we limited to taking care of ourselves? You have to analyze where you are and what you need to do. Now, when you talk about managing the money, it would be good if you had a person in the congregation who maybe someone who works in a bank or who understands accounting. This person should not be turned loose to manage the money alone, but somebody to offer their expert advice in how to handle money and how to manage it. So then you begin to, you have your committee or maybe your deacons or whoever, and your people who understand the works of the church. And so you start itemizing the budget. In other words, you start making this. And so number one ought to be preaching and teaching. And I want to say this. I know that I have talked with a lot of foreign national preachers, and they get support from those outside the congregation where they preach. A lot of times we don't know how much the local congregation does contribute to the work of these preachers. But at any rate, that should be number one on the budget. And preachers, if you're getting outside support for your work and the church locally is not helping you, you need to teach them that this is a part of their work, because part of their job to take care of you. That is the church's responsibility. They may not be able to take care of all your needs, but be careful that you don't live above the average church member and put them in some kind of financial bind. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 14, I'm not sure if this is in the document for the lesson, but Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9:14, so also the Lord directed that those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel. And Paul went on to tell the church at Corinth he didn't use those things, but he could have asked for it. So the preacher should, number one, get help from the local church. And as soon as possible, if he's getting help from outside, maybe he has some kind of special projects that he's doing that the local church can't afford to do, and he may get some assistance from other congregations to do that. But there comes a point where the local church should take care of their preacher, become independent. And that's really the goal of this lesson. So the first item would be preaching and teaching. And then the next item would be benevolent works, helping the poor in the congregation, maybe widows, or in some cases, widowers. Or I know there was a situation in one congregation that I knew about where there was a mother that I don't think the father was in the picture, and she had 2 or 3 children, and she died. Well, it was left to the local congregation to take care of those children. And if I'm not mistaken, in the situation I'm thinking about, the preacher and his wife took those children in. Well, that added a burden to that preacher's and his wife's family. And the church should pitch in and help take care of these motherless children and fatherless children, because they were the children of a Christian woman. That was the real situation. But benevolent works, things to operate. This is number 3. You can see it on the screen. Just what does it take to operate the local congregation other than paying the preacher or helping with benevolent works? And then maybe some operational things. just the maintenance of the building or electricity or whatever is required, and in some situations, insurance for the building and maintenance, things like that. The church should do all it can to volunteer to help, but some things you have to pay someone else to do. And I wanted to add this preaching and teaching too, that if a congregation locally wants to have an evangelistic outreach, the local church should do all it can to finance that. And maybe you have to plan it months in advance and set aside that money. It's like, okay, so let's just say this is, for example, let's say it's the first of the year, and so the middle of the year, we want to do an evangelistic outreach in our area. Well, you could start saving or putting back the money for that, and 6 months of it, okay, this is probably what it will cost for us to do it. Maybe if you invite others to come and help, feeding people or your materials or transportation or whatever. Everything preaching and teaching covers any kind of preaching and teaching that the local church does. And then number 4 could be building and expansion. There may be a need. If the church starts growing, you outgrow your facility, you will need to add on to it. And so you may want to put some money back for that. You analyze your situation to see what your needs are for your particular congregation. And maybe your building is sufficient and you're not going to need a larger building for some time, but then it could be you're coming close to outgrowing your building. Start thinking about, okay, what are we going to do if we need to add on to it, and start putting that money back. We can see the importance of having a budget. And then we take each of these areas, preaching and teaching, benevolence, operational, and then future building and expansion, and put other things as subcategories of those. And all this information is in the material that I have printed or published for you. Now, I want to say something here, like there's a point here, maybe a certain percentage of money should be set aside or used for this. That's not always a fixed number. The percentage of the needs that the financial part will cover, whatever area you need to cover financially, that may be a different percentage for different congregations. But I want to say this, that if the congregation I preach for, they pay as much as they can afford for my work as the local preacher. They don't pay all that I need. And so I do get some help outside the local congregation. But if the point is to think about is if I, for some reason, didn't get that outside support from outside the local congregation, I would still do my best to keep preaching somehow, some way, because that's what I want to do with my life. But these percentages in here on pages 2 and 3, those are not necessarily fixed. You have to figure that out for each local congregation. But you start itemizing the budget and you say, okay, this area, okay, what will it cost? What can the church afford, for example, to pay the local preacher? And also take care of their other expenses, like the operational, take care of the poor. How much can you afford to pay your preacher? In some situations, maybe they can't pay the preacher all that he needs, and he may have to have another job to supplement his income. And there's nothing wrong with that. I know the Apostle Paul was a tent maker. Other churches helped him. I know that Paul did not stay with a local congregation and get his support as a preacher from a single congregation all the time. He was a missionary. He did move around, but he also did tent making. And so along with Priscilla and Aquila, they were tent makers. They worked together. And there may be a point where a preacher may have to do some kind of other work, especially with a small congregation. But now you start itemizing, and then you start looking at point number 3 here. Some expenses are fixed, and some are flexible. In other words, this is a broad lesson. Some places the preacher may not be required to pay income taxes, but in a lot of places they are. But you start looking at these things, or your local utility costs. I mean, you can average, for example, your electricity. What is your average cost for electricity, say, for a year? Then you put that average cost in your budget, depending on where you live and what it is. If you have any kind of insurance, which some congregations don't have that, congregations in the United States do, well, how much does your insurance cost? And that is a fixed item. But then there are some things that are not necessarily fixed. For example, you may not. One of the things we do with our congregation where we are, we'll set a figure of what we have for benevolence for the next year. So much out of the weekly contribution is set aside for benevolence. We may set aside so many dollars. And then you go look at the end of the year. Well, how much did we actually spend on benevolence? Well, a lot of times it may be less than what we expected. In some situations, it might be more than we had budgeted for, but maybe we pulled the money from somewhere else. But you kind of look at the whole year behind you. And one of the things about making a budget is also tracking your expenses. Okay, what did it cost last year for this? What did it cost last year for that? And each item. And you look at those expenses, okay, has anything that we had itemized in our budget, has it increased? In other words, is it costing more now to do that than it did last year? Well, you would adjust your new budget to a higher figure. Some things it might be about the same. So, okay, we just spent this much, for example, on benevolence, and we pretty much spent what we budgeted for. We could probably use that same number for the new budget for the next year. And so you analyze everything. Everything's not the same, and some things do change. But now those churches that are helping, or those elders who are helping other places, like if you bring a speaker in and you're going to pay him right away. If you're supporting something outside the congregation financially, and that, whatever that is, and that maybe it's a school of preaching or whatever, or maybe it's a foreign missionaries, make sure that person or that school is paid on time every time. Don't make them wait for your money. You don't want to wait for yours. Don't make them wait for theirs. And so then once you start looking at everything and you get an idea, okay, this is our budget. This is what, so one of the ways you determine it, let's say we're working on a 2027 budget. We're not there yet, but let's say we were. Okay, this was our contribution in 2026. This is what we want to do. And so maybe the contribution for 2026 was not meeting the needs of the church, and maybe you were kind of coming short. So in 2027, if you come together with, okay, this is what we want to do, this is a reasonable amount of money that we should put in the budget, and then you start looking at it, it's okay, this is how much the contribution should be for what we want to do. And you might even have a little extra. Maybe the contribution may not cover, you may have to add a little extra. I'm trying to say add a little extra to your budget, because let's just say the contribution is X number of dollars. So, okay, let's set the budget at this, and then this way, if we have extra money, you maybe put that in another area for a need, or just, you may have what you call a general fund. What's a general fund? That's money that's kind of set aside, at least on paper, in case this area runs short. Or if this area runs, doesn't spend as much, then you've got that extra money. Just this is where you need someone who understands finances, maybe an accountant or someone who works in a bank and has an idea about money to help you keep everything going and flowing. And so then you look at the whole budget and it's, okay, your committee has looked at everything. This is what we want to do. This is how much we're giving, the church was giving, and say in 2026, say for 2027, this is what it will cost to operate. So then, okay, let's say in 2027, it's going to cost more than it did in 2026. You look at your budget, try to be reasonable with it, and you present it to the church. And you say, brethren, these are the things, and you need to tell the church everything. The church is not a secret organization, neither is the money. So you put it on paper, you present it to the church. So this is what it costs us in 2026 to operate this congregation. This is what it will probably cost us in 2027. And so you say, okay, this is the dollar difference between this current year and the next year. And you come up with a weekly figure that may be a little more than what you actually need, but it gives you a little room in case some unexpected expense comes up. But you figure your budget and say, brethren, this is what we need to give if we want this congregation to do what it wants to do. But here's the thing. When you explain all these works, we need a preacher. This is what we need to pay him. We want to do this evangelistic effort in the middle of the year. This is what this is going to cost us. We have some needy people in this congregation that we have to help from time to time. Now, some people they don't want everybody to know that they've been helped, and maybe you don't do it by name, but maybe they would come to the elders or the deacons, or if you don't have either of those, the men who lead the church, and ask for help. You don't want to embarrass anybody by name. Just help them and just kind of keep it, secret as much as possible. But anyway, you could say this is what we spent on benevolence last year, and we're going to stay with that same figure, for example. Or maybe, and it may take you 2 or 3 years if you've never had a budget. Most churches do, but if you've never had one, it may take you 2 or 3 or 4 years to figure out how to do this and do it well. But you have to start somewhere. And so you go through the items and you present it to the church, and then you teach the church. I would say this: every year, the church needs a good lesson on giving, regardless of how the giving is going. If you're getting plenty of contributions or if you're running short, there's certain topics we need to preach once a year, and giving is one of them. And I would say do it on Sunday morning when most of the brethren are there. And then that would help, to help people understand, because some people, they don't give much of anything. And one of the reasons they don't is we haven't done a good job as we could on teaching them. So then you get the budget subscribed, and then you go to the church. Now, this is a suggestion, this pledge card that's in the lesson that I gave you. This is not a hard and fast rule that you get someone to sign a piece of paper that this is what they're going to give. But if you have elders, for example, and you want to do these cards, and let's say it's for a couple or a single person, family, this family is committed to giving this much money. You don't take that pledge card, they'll sign it, they'll put the number on there. This is what we're planning to give next year. And put it, you don't put that card out there for everybody to see it. The elders would see it, or the deacons may see it and present it to the elders. And if someone asks the elders, well, did you make a pledge? Yes, we did. Yes, we did. This is, and we're giving generously, and we want to help the church too. But it's not a prying into a person's private finances as much as it is okay, this family has pledged to give this much money a week. This family and on down the line, or this individual, and you put all those together, it's okay. And then you know at least some the people who will do that. Some people won't sign a card, and that's fine. But the ones who've done it, this is the money we know that we can count on because they've said they'll give it. And usually there's more money given than what you might tally up from pledge cards. Now, some congregations are uncomfortable doing the pledge cards. It's just an idea, but it does help the elders or the deacons have an idea what the church is willing to give, because we read in 2 Corinthians 9 and verse 7 that we should give as we have purposed in our heart. So let's just say that I talked with my wife and I said, okay, let's just say it's a new year. Okay, this is our income. This is our income for right now. And so out of that income, this is what we plan to give every week for the work of the Lord here where we worship. We should do that as families, whether the elders or the deacons or whoever ask for a pledge card. We need to make a determination on how much we're going to give and give it every week. That way the church can count on our contribution and it's not fluctuating, because there's some brethren, if they miss on a Sunday, they'll give the Sunday they're there, they'll miss a Sunday, and they'll come back the next Sunday. They don't make up for the Sunday before. And so the budget fluctuates. God has commanded all of us to give on the first day of every week. And if I'm not able to be there this Sunday, then the next week I give twice as much, because that would take care of the week before. And the church will do a lot better if we can do that. Not everything I'm saying is in this paper. Now, I'm not going to read this page that's on your screen at the present time, then these particular points. You can study that. I'll just hit it and move. But, well, who should give? Each one should give. Every Christian. When? On the first day of every week. When should one plan their giving? I would say 1 year in advance. Or let's say you change jobs in the middle of the year, and maybe you got an increase in income, maybe you got a decrease in income. You still analyze what you're bringing in and still determine what you can afford to give. The church depends on my decisions and yours. The elders or the deacons or whoever can only work with what we give. They can't work with what we don't give, and we have to plan for it. How much should we give? The Bible says in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, as one has prospered. I want to take a moment with that. So let's say that I have a regular job, for example, and let's just say it pays X number of dollars a week. Okay, that's my income. Well, let's say that somehow I got some extra money. Maybe I got an opportunity to do some kind of job and made some extra money, or maybe someone died and left me some money. You know, we have things that happen that bring us extra money. Well, then if I have figured a certain amount of money by what I get paid, but I get a little extra money, how much of that is the Lord going to get? As we have prospered. So however you figured your original contribution, if you get extra, well, how much of this should I add to my contribution this week because I got this extra money? Those are serious things to think about, because giving as one has prospered means that if you make a certain amount this week and you make more next week, somebody says, well, what if you lose your job? Then you adjust your giving accordingly. I mean, if you're not having income, I'm convinced that the poor widow gave all her living in the Gospel of Luke. So I don't believe there's a time we should never fail to give. We should always give. And then so once you get the congregation to give, then every so often give a report to the congregation. This is how the finances are going. this is what we plan to give. And maybe there was something that came along that hit kind of hard. Maybe there's a little need there, or maybe a big need that was not necessarily in the budget. And you might ask the congregation, you say, we ran short on this, and so we may need to increase just a little bit. I don't ever hear congregations talking about this. It's funny how we don't talk about it. But the more we talk about it, the more we can do. And the more we give, the more the church can do. Now, when you talk about handling the money, who handles the money? In the case of the weekly contribution, we've already mentioned that the elders really should not be handling the money, but they should know what's going on with it. They could give that over to a couple of men to oversee that, or a certain person, like maybe an accountant, someone like that. But that person still needs to show the income and the outgo, or the giving and the expenses. And give a report every now and then on what's going on, at least once a quarter. And the church needs to know about it. I don't believe in this privacy thing. And I can tell you this, the more the church knows, just listen carefully, the more the church knows about how the money is being used, what it's being used for, maybe what it's being accomplished. I'm not talking about specific names of, say, someone that was helped benevolence-wise, but they can see the money at work. I can promise you they're more willing to give. I can promise, but you keep it in secret. Well, where's our money going? We don't know. Nobody ever tells us. But you flip that over and they know where it's going. I guarantee you they're far more willing to give if they know where the money's going. I'm going to leave the rest of this this lesson for your reading, except I do want to look at number 9, like the treasurer. Let's say the treasurer is the one who keeps the books. Maybe the treasurer is the one who makes the bank deposits. And so he doesn't have any power over how money is spent. He uses it the way it has been presented in the budget. But I want to say one more thing too, that I kind of ran past this, and I want to come back to it. So the collection's been made Sunday morning, for example, and the money's in the trays. And then that money after the service should be locked up somewhere safely where people can't get to it. And it's better, maybe best, I could say, for 2 men to handle that, not one. Men are people. And I have heard of people who are tempted, and I know it sounds odd, but they may steal from the church treasury. Well, if there's cash money in there, nobody would know it except them and the Lord. So at least 2 men handling the money, and at least 2 men counting the money, because of that way. Well, look, we don't have one man back there by himself. And then also the other thing is accuracy, to make sure it was counted correctly. And that there's accountability factor here. And so just because a man is a treasurer doesn't give him any special power over how the money is spent. He's just been designated to handle it, not to say how it's spent. If you're going to change that, you go back and have another discussion about it. Now, I'm going to leave the rest of this for your studies. I think I've covered this fairly well in church finances. But I want to say one more thing as we get down toward the end of the lesson. Some of this is suggestions like number 11, changing treasurers. You may not be able to do that, but there may be a situation to do it. It keeps men honest, and it keeps some men from being burdened from having to do it all the time. But there's a point, and I'm talking to foreign national preachers. You must ask the congregation to take care of you to the best of its ability. Don't you burden that church. That's what Paul would not do. He wouldn't burden any churches and take advantage of them. But he would take what they would offer, and he didn't want them to do without themselves. And you don't want to do that with the church. And if you're living way above the average church member, you may want to think about, okay, this is all I'll take from the church, and however else you get money, if it's a secular job or something, well, that's your business. But teach the church to take care of you. And then there'll come a day when the church gets to a certain point. I'm talking about these congregations that maybe are not too many years old. You get to the point where you take care of yourself, then you can start helping other mission points. Reach out and help them. Somebody helped you if you are a relatively new congregation, or somebody came from another place and planted the congregation where you are. That church was able to do that. Well, they had to grow to that point. You can grow to the point that you can do the same thing. Money matters and how we use it. And there are several points in this lesson for those who are in the school. I'm not going to put all of this out there. If you want to enroll in this leadership course, you could start with course number 1 and work through lesson 21. And we are looking for students. And if you want to reach out to us, you can do that through our website, iabsonline.com, if you want to participate in this school and be a student. And God bless you in your studies.